Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your Flip Classroom and our continuing discussion of the outbreak of World War I. All right, so I probably shouldn't shake this table considering how much expensive equipment is on it in this podcast studio. Now, going into it, though, we are about to have a nice, not even condensed, but not crazy long flip about World War I, about its outbreak, about how it was fought, and about some very, very important stuff. So the stuff that we're about to be talking about right now, as it pertains to World War I, you have to understand it isn't going to be a crazy long flip, but it's going to be a crazy important one. The stuff that I'm talking about in this flip is crucial to your understanding of World War I, how it was fought, what did it do, and why the years 1914 to 1918 are going to be such such massive pivotal moments in European history, leading us into a very, very important 1920s and 30s, and then into World War II, and then almost to the end of this entire course, all right? So going into it, though, let's pick up right where we left off, talking about basically the domino effect, right? So the Alliance system fell in on itself following the blank check and the July crisis at the end or tail end of a major event known as the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Now, remember, it wasn't so much about the assassination leading to the war, it was that the choices that were made by the leaders of these places led to war by the beginning of, by the end of 1914, all right? So we've got pretty much most of Europe descending into war by August 1914, all right? Now, the earliest phases of the war are going to be very, very important because it's going to pull in another major player, and it's also going to create the imagery of World War I that you're going to need to know, all right? So going into it, you need to understand that very, very first and foremost, the Germans want to try and avoid what is known as a two-front war. And they are going to use a very specific plan known as the Schlieffen Plan to try and avoid this two-front war. For those of you who do not understand what a two-front war is, basically, in essence, the Germans and the Austrians are stuck right here, and that's why they're referred to as the Central Powers, right? Because they're in the middle of the continent of Europe. A two-front war means that they would be fighting Russia on this side and France and the other allies on this side, right? Hence having a two-front war because you got one front here and one front there. They want to do their best to avoid this because it splits your supplies, it splits your military, it makes you very, very ineffective militarily and ultimately much weaker. So the Schlieffen Plan is going to be used to try and avoid this. Now, what the Schlieffen Plan said was a very, very simple little thing created by this man named Otto Schlieffen, right? So now, well, first of all, Schlieffen's dead by this point, all right? Schlieffen, this general, had anticipated a very large war may break out at some point whenever the Germans whenever the French court the Russians, whenever the French courted the Russians, Arthur Schlieffen was very nervous that a two-front war might break out. So his idea was to take 90% of the German military to sweep through Belgium and attack France's north end to get to Paris and force their surrender, right? To attack them very fast, very quick, knock the French out so you can then focus all of your attention back on Russia. Now, the issue was, though, is that after Schlieffen died, the German military started being like, oh, maybe you don't need 90%, maybe we can do 80. And they just kept notching it down until when they actually tried to enact this entire thing in the earliest expanses of the 1900s, what's going to end up happening is they don't send enough people and they end up getting stopped up, right? Now, what ends up happening is the Schlieffen Plan ultimately fails because at this place known as the Battle of the Marne, right? And at the Battle of the Marne, by the way, really, really quickly, most battles for the World War I you don't need to know. They don't even really want you to know that many World War II battles. I do talk a lot about World War II battles, though, so prepare yourself for that. So getting into it, though, the Battle of the Marne is the place where the Schlieffen Plan failed and the location of the very first trenches, all right? Do me a favor, highlight that word, trenches. It's going to be very, very important in our discussion of all this stuff. Why, you might ask, were these trenches dug? Well, it all happens to do with technology, all right? So when the very first battles at the Battle of the Marne and stuff like that outside of Belgium are going to actually be commenced in front of the Germans versus the French, what's going to end up happening is the debut of an ultimately new and very important weapon, that of the Maxim machine gun, right? The Germans have some, the French have some, and they get stopped up geographically right at this place known as the Marne, which is a river in northern France, right? And so the battle, I got to look that up before one of you trolls online is just like, actually the Marne is, I got to look that up actually and double check where the Marne is. But really, really quickly though, going into it, what ends up happening is these two armies come clashing into one another, and they start firing machine gun rounds at each other. How do you get underneath a machine gun gun fire, you dig a ditch, right? And they dug the trenches to get below the first machine gun fire, unfortunately cementing them into these two locations. Now, when the Schlieffen Plan gets enacted and the Germans sweep through Belgium, Britain will then enter the war on the side of the French, because they told Germany, don't you dare touch Belgium, because they are neutral in this conflict. Because the Belgians are like, we're a brand new little country, we've only been here for like 5 minutes. And then they were like, please don't come in here. And then the Germans were like, nah, they're doing it anyway. And they just invaded Belgium regardless. Now, the Belgian resistance is going to be very important during this early part of the war, because they blew up railroads and slowed the Germans down, leading even further to them getting stopped up at the Battle of the Marne, all right? So the British then enter into this war and begin their mobilization process in August, and the first trenches are being dug as early as 1914, right? So how this whole thing started is also very, very important, okay? How it ends up beginning or starting is mostly a period of enthusiasm, right? A lot of people actually said early on that there were parades in the streets of Venice and Berlin and Paris in excitement for this war, right? So how this entire thing starts is actually with soldiers looking a lot like this, right? A lot of enthusiasm, a lot of excitement. These countries leapt willingly into war, as it's said, right? Leapt willingly into war. There were parades, there were flowers being given. These young German soldiers are jumping into a boxcar, excitedly writing things in German on the side like Auf Wiedersehen auf dem Boulevard, which means like farewell from the boulevard. And this one over here, that my struggle will meet the end of my sword, right? Like, so all these things basically saying that the Germans will go off and be victorious, and everybody was super excited. But the war very quickly, by 1915, this is how it was going, right? It was actually a disgusting, muddy, gross conflict that is characterized by trench warfare, disease, and weapons that the world had never seen before. So those same soldiers that were super stoked about this war starting are going to be the same ones that are depressed about how it did not end by Christmas, right? Because everybody was saying, oh, it'll be over by Christmas. It wasn't, all right? So going into what you have to understand is that World War I quickly descended into what is known as total warfare, right? Total warfare and trench warfare. Now, trench warfare is pretty simple. We'll explain it a lot in class. We'll explain the two key components of it being, of course, not only the, like, no man's land of, like, this trench, that trench, and how you break these things and stuff. But going into it, what you have to understand about trench warfare, though, is it will be a two-front war. There will be one trench line over towards France, which will be known as the Western Front, and then you're going to know that there's going to be another front line over towards the east, known as the Eastern Front, between Russia and Germany, all right? So the total trench warfare, though, or total war, what it means, we now need to identify what the word total warfare means. After these countries descend into this chaos, they are going to be enacting total war policies, both economically, politically, and physically, okay? And what that means is a war that in which the distinction between the soldiers and the citizens is heavily blurred, all right? Basically, all the factories that were originally making clothes for consumer consumption are now making uniforms for the military. If you used to own a factory that makes hinges for doors, you're now making bullets for the military, right? Because that line between your country's economy and the war itself is heavily blurred. And all means of production are going towards the war effort itself, okay? So these countries have descended into a moment where their entire world economy, their world knowing, their world everything, their news, it's all about the war, right? And this is also going to be characterized in that trench warfare era known as the race for the sea. Because this is a really, really important thing as well in your understanding of trench warfare. So I just defined total warfare, now I'm explaining trench warfare. Because some of you are thinking to yourself, well, Mr. Cherry, whenever they dug these trenches, how long were they? Were they like, like 200 yards long, and then there was some other space of flat land, and then there was another trench? No. The way these things worked is crazy. On the Western Front, which was characterized by trench warfare, you are going to see one contiguous trench. And what I mean by that is you had trenches and trench networks that went for over 400 miles, all right? 400 miles. Because let's say, hypothetically speaking, that this is the very first area of the trench that has been dug, right? Now, when you're attacking this end, all you would want to do is try to flank them and go around them and stuff like that. So they would dig their trench a little bit further to try and outflank you, but then you would dig your trench a little bit further to try and outflank them. And basically what ends up happening is the trench lines just keep growing and growing and growing until they hit the Northern Sea and the English Channel, right? And then they started digging them southern and southern and southern until they went all the way almost to the Mediterranean, right? So that is known as the race for the sea, you had these massive trench networks that went for hundreds and hundreds of miles, right? And the elements of trench warfare are also going to be very important as well. Basically, what defines trench warfare is how do you beat someone who is dug in like that, right? How do you fight a war from a ditch? How do you fight a war from an almost buried position? Like, what are you supposed to do here? Well, the problem is what it's going to lead to, right? What trench warfare ultimately led to is this thing known as a stalemate, right? And what a stalemate is basically where neither side is really winning. The Germans would send massive attacks at the French, and a large number of their people would die, gaining no real ground or maybe a few yards, right? The French would then do the same to them, and a lot of Frenchmen would die, and then they would only maybe gain a handful of yards, right? They just keep attacking each other to no avail whatsoever. We're using outdated military strategy to just keep going and going and going. And no one's winning, because that's what a stalemate is fierce attacks and no one's gaining any kind of like positivity or positive gain, right? And they're attacking each other over this area known as no man's land, right? Now, the earliest idea to break the stalemate that had actually started on the Western fronts, all right, particularly in the Western fronts, is known as going over the top, right? Now, over the top was a strategy that was used by these really, really dumb generals like Douglas Haig, who is an awful human being. All right, so where it was that basically, oh, I'm going to blow a whistle, tweet, and then everyone's going to jump out of the trench and run over the land between our two trenches, known as no man's land, and attack the Germans in their trench. Doesn't this make genius ideas right here? Isn't this brilliant, right? No, it's not. There's a reason why the area between the trenches is referred to as no man's land. It's called no man's land because if you go out there, you will be no man any longer. You'll be dead. All right, so yeah, because you're just getting shot at by machine guns and snipers and stuff like that. It's absolutely ridiculous. And the earliest weapons that came out during this war, it's the very first major warfare that's going to see the industrialism and the second wave of industrialism really hit soldiers very, very badly and really cause massive casualties, are going to be things that we've already talked about. Rifles, machine guns, but a big two that are also going to be very popular in the earliest phases of the war are artillery and barbed wire, all right? Now, artillery are these bad boys, all right? What artillery is basically a giant cannon that would lob an explosive shell over no man's land and try to drop it into the enemy trench. That gun right there, known as an artillery shell, is going to be the thing that claims the most lives of soldiers in World War I and of citizens as well. This is going to be a major, major weapon that's very, very important. Because you would put it behind your trench and go, fire, boom, and it would go, bow, and it would explode all up in the trench lines of your enemy, right? Sometimes actually friendly fire hitting other people as well. At the Battle of the Somme, they launched somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.6 million shells at the German lines to try and destroy one element of them. They wanted to get rid of this stuff. Barbed wire. Why is barbed wire, you're asking, such an important facet of World War I military strategy? It's because it protected the front of your trench from enemy run-ins or enemy charge. And so people were basically just charging at you, but when they got into this barbed wire, they got caught in it and they couldn't get out. And then people would just pick them off very, very slowly. They used artillery shells sometimes to try and blow up barbed wire, and then when the dust would settle, the barbed wire would still be there, right? But what's going to end up happening is countries are going to start developing new weapons to try and break the stalemate, right? To try and cause as many casualties as they possibly can, including landmines, and the big dog one that you need to write down, poisonous gas, right? Poisonous gas including chlorine gas, mustard gas, and phosgene gas, right? They try to use this stuff to break the trench fronts, to mask their people, but this will then lead to the development of gas masks. You're going to see Zeppelins, which are really, really big bombers that are blimps. You can see airplanes for the very first time ever used in 1915 as military vehicles and weaponry due to this thing known as the Fokker scourge. We'll talk about who Anton Fokker was in class later on. I can't change his name. His name is Fokker. All right, so now look, really quick. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. And then also tanks, right? And tanks make their debut in 1916, right? And tanks were literally used just across no man's land as a big iron box to protect the people inside. But leave a little bit of space, like 2 lines of space underneath that list of weapons right there, because we're going to go further with those in class and talk a little bit more about them. And the outdated strategy that they were using at the time was basically this idea of new weaponry would equal mass casualties and stuff like that. And they thought to themselves that we need to charge through the trench lines, break it, and then roll them up. Now, this is outdated because that's what cavalry strikes used to be used to do in the 1800s. And these old generals, these old fuddies like Douglas Haig, are going to keep throwing human death and suffering at this, being like, we'll just keep charging. It'll work, men. It'll work. Give it a minute. And it doesn't work ever. And so that leads to mass casualties and low morale, right? For example, in the first few hours of the Somme attack, which was a very, very large engagement between the British and the Germans, right? In the northern areas of the Western Front, they lost 300,000 men in a few hours. And at the Battle of the Somme, over 1 million men would die, right? And that low morale means people are losing their want to fight, okay? So you have to understand this is going to lead to a further stalemate and an entrenchment in a lot of issues, right? So World War I is going to become what is known as a war of attrition by 1915. In the earliest year of the war, people are realizing already that there's no way to just outright win this war. You are winning a war of attrition. And what an attrition war, a war of attrition is basically you are trying to starve your enemy of supplies until they surrender, right? Because they have no will to fight anymore. That right there is attrition, right? The sustained process of wearing down an opponent so as to force their physical collapse, right? The British Allied strategy to hasten attrition or to try and starve out the Germans as fast as possible, to get their people to the point where they literally had no food, no supplies, no stuff to be able to keep fighting, was to blockade Germany and cause massive hunger riots, right? So that actually was pretty effective, right? They used a huge number of boats, right? Big dreadnoughts to blockade the German shores in their northern ports because they only have a very small strip of land where they can actually bring in imports, and they wanted to blockade Germany, causing the people back home to suffer, causing hunger riots that would actually break out all over Germany. This, for example, is a picture of a butcher shop that actually was succumbed inside of one of the cities in Germany. I don't know where it actually happened, but this right here, you see the butcher shop, all the windows have been busted out, right? And all the windows have been broken and stuff like that, and people raided in there to try and get food because of those British blockades. Well, the German response to this is a very, very important thing known as unrestricted submarine warfare. Now, what unrestricted submarine warfare is was a very dangerous German strategy where they're using their new toy that everybody thought was going to be garbage because everybody was like, we can't see them and you can't do anything with them, so they aren't that effective. Turns out that the Germans bet on black and hit on this one, right? Submarines turned out to be a very useful piece of technology in World War I. And what unrestricted submarine warfare is the Germans start shooting down with their torpedoes and their submarines anybody that comes across them, whether it be a dreadnought or a naval vessel or a cruise ship or a fishing boat, or if it's just Kylie Burke in a kayak, right? They just literally start shooting down anything they can get their hands on, right? And that makes a lot of people upset, especially when the Germans attack this boat. In 1915, they sunk a boat known as the Lusitania, right? Which was a cruise ship coming from New York City going to Liverpool, England, right? And when this boat, known as the U-20, underneath Captain, I think Steiger was his name. I'll have to look that up. And because there was a very popular German soccer player named Schweinsteiger. Different guy, though. Got to look up what that actual captain's name is. But the captain of U-20 decided to sink a cruise vessel where 1,200 people are going to die, right? 1,200 people die, 128 of them being Americans die when the Lusitania is sunk. And what ends up happening is Woodrow Wilson, the president of the United States, tells Germany, hey, Germany, stop sinking cruise boats with people on them. That's mean. And also it kind of violates the rules of war. And if you keep this up, neutral America will get involved in this war. And so Germany put their hands up. They're like, all right, bro. All right, sorry, we'll stop. Right? So yeah, and they back off of it for a little while, right? But what it does end up happening also by 1915, fighting is breaking out everywhere. In African colonies, in the Middle East, while the British are supporting Arab revolts, right? And that leads to this thing known as the Armenian Genocide in 1915. And the Eastern Front also is breaking out, where Russia is getting destroyed. But we'll talk about these 4 things when we get back to class, because I want to let y'all go so you can kind of chill a little bit, and I wanted to keep this bad boy under 20 minutes, okay? But we'll talk about these 4 things real quick when we get back to class and discuss why they were such a big deal, and we'll review all the stuff that we just talked about. But I'll see y'all soon.